Hello everyone, P from 41 here. So today I want to go through some of the arcade games I own and just talk about them a bit, their histories, where I got them, things like that, what I've done to them. So we're going to go ahead and start with the very first one I ever got. This is a treasure chest crane. I bought this off a guy who would buy storage units and then sell off the pieces individually. He had this in one of his units. He plugged it in, messed around with it a bit, but it just wasn't working. It was giving an error message and not really responding. He didn't have anybody who could fix it, didn't have anyone who wanted it, so he listed it for sale cheap. So I got this for $100, which is a really good deal. It did have a bunch of stuffed animals as well as toys and some fireworks in it when I got it. I can't explain to you why there were fireworks in it. It also had a lot of birdseed in it, which I can't explain to you. It turns out that there was a stuffed animal that had ripped open and it was stuffed with birdseed for reasons I don't understand. But I didn't figure that out until I got to the very bottom and found that stuffed animal. So the entire time I was cleaning out, I was wondering why it was full of birdseed. Now, based on some of the toys that I found in it, I'm guessing that this thing could have very well been taken out of service sometime in the late 90s, early 2000s. Either that or those toys just stuck around for a very, very, very long time. Now, I'm pretty sure that this particular crane is a 1995 model because when you start it up and it goes through its testing cycle, it reads out 1995 on the readout. Now, when I got it, there's not a whole lot of diagnostic information on these. The company, I believe, was bought out at some point, so you can't really get good technical support. There's not a lot of good documentation. I did manage to figure out that the error code was from a limit switch because these things will move around and test all the limit switches. And what had happened is these motors for the crane and this trolley and everything require capacitors, and one of the legs had broken off of one of the capacitors, so the motor wasn't moving and therefore wasn't hitting the limit switches and it was erroring out. Fixed that, it was good to go. I did a lot of service on the trolley as well and the various other parts. It looked like it had been in an environment where it was damp or it had gotten wet at some point. The wood for the control panel was just all swollen and falling apart, so I ended up replacing that. Also repainted the control panel, which is pretty rusty. It does look like it needs to have the bolt heads touched up at this point. It also had a fair bit of corrosion on the main board and all the switches, so I put in all new switches, all new micro switches for the joystick. I swapped out the token mechs, got rid of the lockout solenoids because I didn't need them and they were just in the way. After that, it ran fine. I did eventually swap out the main board due to corrosion causing intermittent problems. I replaced the lights on the side here. It turns out these were originally 120 volt lights. It just uses a basic flasher. So it was around Christmas time when I did all of this, so I was able to just grab some red rope lights from Walmart, put those in there, plug them in, and it was all good to go. I've been pretty happy with the way this game turned out. It actually does get played quite a bit, especially the young kids. They really like to play it. And I've been filling it up with plushies. I filled it up once or twice now. So next one I want to talk about is this candy crane. Now this candy crane, I'm certain, is made by the same company who made that treasure chest. And the reason I say that is because a lot of the construction and a lot of the parts are actually the same as that one. In fact, the only things that are really different is the size, the color, and various components having to do with the fact that this one's meant for candy instead of toys like that one is. Now this is a play until you win crane, as you can clearly see by the sign. So it has a sensor in the prize chute where the candy drops out, and it will allow you to keep playing until it senses that something has fallen through that chute. Now I got one hell of a deal on this game. I picked this up for $50, which is a really good deal. And the only thing that was really wrong with it is this claw would not open up properly. The jaws were a bit bent up. The guy who sold it to me usually sells car parts, especially new old stock for like classic cars and stuff, and he ended up with this and he didn't really want to deal with it, so he just sold it cheap. So that's how I got it for 50 bucks. I bent the jaws straight again and added a little spring, and it really hasn't had any issues since then. Did some maintenance work on the trolley up here as well. I recapped the power supply because it was starting to sound kind of whiny, and I saw some evidence of capacitor failure. I added LED lights on the corners here with an LED flasher. The reason I didn't go with rope lights on this one is because the original flasher had failed, and it was a lot cheaper and easier to find LED strip lights and an LED flasher than it was to find a 120 volt flasher. And then the rope lights that were in there also just generally weren't in very good condition. Overall, I've been pretty happy with this game. The only thing I don't like about it is that because it is a candy crane and because it is play until you win, you do have to refill the candy on a pretty regular basis, and that candy is not as cheap as you would think. I spend over $200 on a box every time. Granted, it's a very large box, but still, you do have the added expense of candy to factor in with this game. So this is my Dragon Punch. I bought this from a guy in Clearwater, which is about a 3-hour drive away from here. So this is one of the few games I've bought that was actually in working order when I bought it. Didn't really need much at all. So I paid $700 for this. I'm sure somebody's going to tell me that I overpaid for it, but that seems to be about the going rate or less than the going rate for these things around here. I actually took this thing all apart so that it would fit in the back of my truck so I could bring it home, because I did not bring a trailer with me. And trust me, this thing is heavy. It's made out of steel, very heavy steel, not easy to move at all. I have done a few things to it. Now, anybody who's familiar with these games is probably noticing that there seems to be something missing from this general area. From the factory, they have a lot of foam right around here, and it's got some symbols in it. Unfortunately, when I got mine, that foam was all just falling apart, and I couldn't really easily get a replacement for that. So I opted to just take all the foam off. Unfortunately, it was all stuck on there pretty good, and that was a lot easier said than done. And you can still see there's some remnants here and there that I haven't been able to get off, and if you look back here, there's some more residue from that foam. This is not factory. I actually drilled this hole here and then put this grate over here. Right behind here is the speaker. From the factory, it's just kind of mounted there in the frame with no hole, and with the amount of noise that was present in this building when all the games are on, you could barely hear it. So I went ahead and drilled that hole and added this grate just so that you could hear it more clearly without having to max out the volume. Now, the guy I got it from was using it in his house, and they weren't using coins or anything. What they were doing is they were just hitting the service coin button, which would add credits. And because they were doing it that way, they would just let the door hang open when they add credits. And because the limiter was mounted down here, when they did that, it ended up putting too much stress at the bottom there and bent this door right about here. So you can see I've actually added some flat bar on both sides after bending that door straight, just to ensure it doesn't have any problems in the future. I did at one point swap out the coin comparator because it was intermittently just not accepting coins. Other than that, I haven't really done much at all to this game. I'm a big fan of this game. A lot of kids really like it, and the adults really like it as well. They especially like to challenge each other to see who can get the high score. Now, what's interesting about these games is that most of the punching games, it has a lever that the punch ball sits on, and you hit it and it swings back up, and that's how it measures it. This one is actually on a rope. So when you play it, you pull this rope down, and when you hit the ball, it actually hits this plate back here, and it's got a sensor in there that measures how hard you hit this plate. So what really matters is how hard this plate gets hit. And the nice thing about that is you don't have to hit it straight on. There's nothing's going to happen if you accidentally hit it crooked. The guy I bought it from said that with the other ones, the ones with the arm, if you don't hit it straight on, you can actually break your hand. I don't know if that's true or not. That's just what he told me. But yeah, I've been very, very happy with this game. So this is my Atari Rush the Rock. It was originally a San Francisco Rush, but it was converted to a Rush the Rock before I got it, which is a very common conversion on these. You can see the game is Rush the Rock, the marquee is Rush the Rock, but the cabinet artwork and the pedestal artwork is all still San Francisco Rush. Now these games actually predate the much more common Fast and the Furious arcade games that everyone probably knows. But much like those games, it has force feedback and you can link multiple games together to play against each other. Now this game is another game that I got dirt cheap. I got this for $200. I bought it from a guy. He had a couple arcade games. I don't really remember where he got this one from, but he never got it working. There's nothing on the screen. It would turn on, but it just wouldn't do anything. The monitor, as it turns out, was not even hooked up to anything. So it was a bit of a gamble, but I decided to go for it. And I quickly learned that these things are very heavy and very awkward to move. There was some damage in the back, which I will talk about later, and also you can't take these things apart. With like the Nicktoons Racing and the Fast and the Furious, you can actually separate the seat bases from the rest of the cabinet, which makes them pretty easy to move. You can't do that on these ones. You have to move it all at once. So that, combined with the damage in the back, made it very hard to move around. So it had a D9200 monitor in it. I was able to get that working, got it all connected, but then it had an issue with the tube, so I ended up swapping the tube, and it came out pretty well. We got picture. The next issue was the force feedback board. The reason it wouldn't play when it was at the guy's house is because if they detect an issue with the force feedback at startup, it will display a warning and you have to hit the abort button to continue. So I ended up swapping out the force feedback board. Unfortunately, it has started having issues again, so once again, force feedback is not working. Other than that, I've done a bunch of various small things. I got a new reproduction marquee because the old one was falling apart. Recapped the power supply and put in a new fan because the fan was on its way out and the caps weren't looking too great. It's running a newer hard drive. The original hard drives that these came with, which this one did have the original hard drive, they were prone to failure. Luckily mine was working and I ended up cloning it to a new one just for reliability's sake. I put a new sensor in the force feedback wheel. Did a bunch of general cleanup, painted a few things. I had some damage at the back of the cabinet, and because of that, the wheels and the feet, they weren't really working that great, so I had to repair that, and then I had to build a new back panel for this game because there was no back panel for it. So I put this game on location and it hasn't really had any issues at all since I put it here, just that one force feedback issue. It does have a tendency to give me an error that it can't read the serial and can't read the clock. I'm not really sure why it does that, but it does not affect gameplay. So this game does decently well. Of course, we've got a lot newer racing games next to it, so it doesn't do quite as well as those, but it still gets played a fair amount, and there's a lot of people who really like these games. I'm pretty happy with it. But yeah, that's my Atari Rush the Rock.